Shabbat Shalom, my friends. I want to dedicate our study this week to the memory of a very precious friend. Eugene Cain passed away this week. May his memory ever be for a blessing. Okay, so here we are. It's so good to be back into what I would like to call our Torah bubble for 12 or 13 minutes every 7 days. We just set aside all concerns and rejoice in texts that shape the moral and ethical basis of the world within which we live. We don't turn to Torah to gather irrefutable data about how things were some 3,000 years ago, but rather to gather the stories, the parables, the musar, the ethical teachings, the metaphors, the worldview that continue to challenge and inspire us. We'll find in the book of Numbers the most famous blessings in all of Jewish life. We'll also encounter a talking donkey here, but that's okay. But that talking donkey actually has something to say to us, something we're going to have to hear. And we'll get drawn into a vicious and very personal rebellion against Moses, a rebellion that has a disastrous end, even though there are no dragons or three-eyed ravens anywhere. And the cycle of the Jewish calendar continues. We finish counting the Omer, and in traditional circles, we begin now the reading of sections of Pirkei Avot from now until Rosh Hashanah. Unpaid announcement. If you are going to study Pirkei Avot now, and I do recommend it, I strongly suggest that you look at the book Pirkei Avot, a social justice commentary by Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz. You will be glad that you did. End of unpaid announcement. To our text. The Sedra is NASO, Numbers chapter 4, verse 21 and following. Here we find the trial of an accused adulteress. And here we find rules governing the Nazir, anyone who was given up wine and getting a haircut and even attending to a funeral for a loved one in fulfillment of a vow, Nazir. And there's even a brief mention of Nachshon, who gets superhero status in later Midrashim. Aviva Zornberg has written that much of the book of Numbers deals with the question, who and what really count? Counting matters for us as a covenanted people because the sum total of people and the sum total of things and the sum total of acts and the sum total of statements are fundamental to our people's narrative. We note that in Hebrew, LISPOR means to tell a SIPPUR, a story, LISPOR. And LISPOR, same Hebrew root, means to count. Telling a story based upon what counts. We begin our story of origins with a promise by God to Abraham that Abraham's people will become more numerous than the stars of the heaven, more numerous than the sands upon the shores of the sea. Success will require a counting that joyously cannot be completed. Impossible. We have a census, a counting, at the beginning of the book of Numbers, and another census at the end. People literally are being counted, but not every person counts. In the first census, men count far more than women, and men of military age count far more than the very young and the very old. But the men who count are counted in a very instrumental way. Moses and his commanders needed to know how many men were fit for combat. So everyone was counted, but it was really just the young men who really counted. But the second census in Numbers is a count that takes place at the end of the 40 years wandering. Now what is being counted is the new generation, since it was God's will that the generation of Israelites that left Egypt were to die out before the land of promise could be entered. So this counting is bitterly painful and profoundly frightening. God's angry promise has now been fulfilled, so we are counting those who no longer were there. We were counting absences, those who are now eternally missing, as well as the next generation, the armed chalutzim, ready to stake their claim to what will become their homeland. This isn't the only time in the Bible when absences are counted. In a powerful scene playing out in the conflict between King Saul and the young David, there came a moment when David realized that there could be no reconciliation, no compromise between himself and Saul. So David failed to show up at the king's table for a meal, and that absence was like a spear plunged into Saul's heart. Vayipaked makom David. David's place could not be counted. It was, in fact, his absence that was counted. And dire events would surely follow. In our Sedra, we're told of a husband who suspected that his wife was guilty of adultery. Her word, her testimony, did not count. She had to undergo something like a trial by fire. She was made to drink a vile concoction. If she suffered horrendous consequences from that drink, then she was guilty of adultery and she would suffer further consequences. But if she came through this test without consequence, she was allowed to return to her husband. The woman doesn't count at all here. The woman's word doesn't count at all. And the best part of this is that if she passes the test, she is allowed to return to her husband. No harm, no foul. Her feelings don't count. Her word doesn't count. She doesn't count. Now, Zornberg then quotes Annie Dillard, an essayist who wrote about one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, Ted Bundy. Dillard writes that after his arrest, Bundy could not comprehend the fuss. What was the big deal? Quote, I mean, there are so many people. There are so many people, so why worry about the more than 30 people he brutally murdered? Some things count, and some things simply do not. What we decide counts tells us a great deal about ourselves. Dillard reminds us that there are perhaps, 80 billion galaxies, hundreds of billions of suns. How do we decide what counts in a world filled with so much that is countless? How do we choose what really counts? There are no absolute standards here, no prepackaged answers. We can only make our own decisions. We can say that nothing counts. And many people believe that. We live, we die, so why think about whether an act or a relationship count? Maybe I count, and nothing else counts, or maybe I don't even count. Does friendship count? Does love count? Does our promise count? Does our apology count? Or can it only count when certain acts follow that apology so that those acts are more important than the apology? Does our yearning count? Does our disdain count? Does our integrity count? Or is concern for integrity merely a vestigial remain of something we once used to think was important. We create our narrative as a people by what it is that we choose to count. We create our narrative as human beings, as parents, as friends, as students, as citizens, by what it is that we choose to count. There are no analytical tools available. But with every gesture, with every word, with every embrace, and yes, with every absence, our choices become clear. So let's choose wisely, simply because the world depends upon it. That's it for today. Have a wonderful Shabbat, and as we think about what really counts in our lives, please hit share as a sign that we think our study counts. Shabbat Shalom and a great week.